Picture this alone figure on the battlefield, gleaming katana catching the sun, clad in imposing Yoroi armor. The samurai, an enduring icon of honor, loyalty, and supreme fighting prowess in feudal Japan. You think you know their story, don't you? Tales of the fierce Genpei War, the mighty Kamakura shogunate, or perhaps the romanticized image seen in films. But what if I told you that resonant name, samurai, originally had nothing to do with being a warrior? Seriously, its roots lie deep in the verb saburo, meaning to serve, to attend, or even to wait upon. Cast your mind back to the 700s AD. Then, samurai were merely household attendants to the nobility, guards protecting the imperial court. Less battlefield glory, more quiet duty. An astonishingly humble beginning for a class that would later shape the very destiny of Japan. Quite the contrast, isn't it? So, how did these tendants undergo such a dramatic transformation? How did they ascend from roles of servitude to become Japan's ruling military class for almost 7 centuries? What trials honed their horsemanship during the gritty Emishi campaigns? And more profoundly, how did that original spirit of saburo, the very essence of service and unwavering loyalty, become etched into the heart of Bushido, defining their lasting cultural legacy, even when supreme power rested firmly in their hands? Let's forget the familiar images for a moment. Let's journey deep into the origins, exploring their full, epic, and volatile history. From their unassuming dawn to the heights of power, and their evolution during peacetime. Are you ready to uncover the true story of the samurai? Intrigued by the samurai's surprising start? Hit like and subscribe. Stick around as we explore their rise to power, the brutal Sengoku Wars featuring legends like Nobunaga and Ieyasu, the profound influence of Zen, and their transformation during the long Tokugawa peace. The most dramatic parts are coming. We just uncovered a rather stunning truth. The celebrated name, samurai, that powerful symbol of strength and honor, actually sprang from the concept of service, saburo. The image of an attendant, a caretaker, seems worlds apart from the mounted warrior we typically envision. It's a dramatic contrast, isn't it? Like discovering a mighty river begins as a tiny, humble stream hidden deep in the mountains. But it was precisely from these seemingly unremarkable beginnings that one of the most unique and powerful social classes in Japanese history gradually took shape. So, how exactly did this incredible transformation unfold? What factors forged their identity and strength? Let's wind back the clock, journeying to the early centuries AD, where the seeds of the samurai first began to sprout. Let's truly absorb the root word, saburo. It doesn't echo with the clang of steel or the thunder of hooves. It carries the resonance of waiting, of watching over, of quiet loyalty. Around the 8th century, when the emperor's power was being consolidated under the Richari system, a centralized legal code modeled after China, those called samurai, weren't field commanders directing armies. They were attendants within noble households, guards posted at gates, protectors ensuring the personal safety of the court aristocracy in the capital, Heian-kai modern-day Kyoto. Picture the scene: polished wooden palace corridors where officials and ladies, in waiting, draped in elaborate silks, discussed affairs of state or recited poetry. Mingling among them, figures in simpler attire, ever watchful, their eyes fixed on their masters. These were the first samurai. Their role was predominantly civil, focused on personal security, not yet the elite warriors of the battlefield. They were the human shields protecting the luxury and political machinations at the center of power. But then, the wheels of history began to turn. Moving into the 12th century, a subtle yet significant shift started occurring in the usage of the word samurai. It gradually became more associated with military roles. Initially, some records suggest it referred to lower-ranking foot soldiers without significant landholdings, serving under gokunin, higher-ranking warriors who held land and were direct vassals of the shogunate, the military government yet to be fully formed. Interestingly, perhaps even ironically, according to scholar Michael Wirt, if you had called an elite warrior before the 17th century a samurai, they might have actually felt insulted. Why? Because in those earlier periods, the term still carried the faint echo of saburo, emphasizing the social functions of service, rather than the military function and high status they craved. It was akin to calling a general gatekeeper. Therefore, This semantic evolution wasn't just about language. It mirrored a quiet but powerful revolution unfolding within Japanese society. Power was slowly slipping from the hands of the court nobility and into the grasp of those who held actual military strength in the provinces. And most crucially, that root concept of saburo, regardless of the shifting meaning, etched itself deep into the spiritual DNA of the samurai, becoming a core value that never truly faded: loyalty and unwavering devotion to one's master. Even as they rose to become powerful lords, the ideal of service to their lord's daimyo, or the shogun, remained a pillar of Bushido, the way of the warrior. That initial, humble social function profoundly shaped the moral compass of an entire class. The narrative arc from servant to ruling warrior is one of the most compelling stories of ascent and transformation in Japanese history. Alongside samurai, another term is critically important: bushi. It carries a broader meaning: warrior, or member of the fighting class. If samurai initially emphasized the role of service, bushi highlighted martial skill and warrior origins. So where did these bushi come from? They didn't just materialize out of thin air. Their rise was a gradual process, stretching throughout the Heian period, 794–1185, an era often remembered for the elegance of its court culture. But beneath that refined veneer, the power of the central government was steadily weakening. Before the mid-Heian period, those involved in military affairs were mostly state officials, part of the Ritsuri system's structure. There wasn't yet a distinct warrior class, with its own unique cultural and social characteristics. But as the court's authority in Kyoto faded, it struggled to manage and protect distant territories, especially the private estates known as shiwen. Who would protect these profitable lands from bandits, from the encroachment of other local powers? Who would ensure taxes were collected and sent to the capital, though increasingly less reliably? The answer was the bushi. The aristocracy and wealthy Buddhist temples began hiring men with fighting skills in the provinces to act as estate managers and private security forces for their shien. Initially, there might have been some distinction, perhaps seeing the early court-affiliated samurai as more akin to armed civil servants, while the bushi represented a broader provincial pool of recognized martial talent: minor nobles, officials, influential locals given the court's nod to bear arms. Think of the bushi as the wider current of martial capability from which the more formalized stream of samurai, defined by specific loyalties and roles, would eventually flow and, in time, merge. Over time, the distinction blurred, the terms becoming near synonyms as the warrior class solidified its identity. The crucial point to emphasize here is the provincial origin of the bushi. They didn't rise to prominence under the glittering lights of Kyoto. Their power took root and grew in the periphery, far from the direct control of the imperial court. This is a key factor. This decentralization of military power was the essential prerequisite for the collapse of the old system and the later rise of military governments, the shogunates, bakufu. Ironically, the nobility, seeking to protect their distant assets, inadvertently sowed the seeds of the very forces that would replace them. They relied on provincial bushi, granting them managerial authority and the right to bear arms. Therefore, the bushi gradually accumulated experience, built their own followings, established local reputations and loyalties. When they were strong enough, they were no longer mere hired hands. They became autonomous forces, powerful enough to challenge and eventually overthrow the central government that had once employed them. This is the essence of feudalism's formation in Japan. If the social origins of the samurai bushi lay in the need for provincial protection, a significant part of their elite combat skills originated from a long, drawn-out conflict in the north, the campaigns to subjugate the Emishi people. The Emishi were indigenous tribes inhabiting the Tohoku region, northeastern Japan today. They were considered barbarians by the Kyoto court, but they were far from easily subdued. For centuries, the imperial armies struggled to pacify this region. Why? Because the Emishi were masters of guerrilla warfare and, crucially, mounted archery. Imagine the imperial army, largely composed of heavy infantry, moving slowly, accustomed to conventional, formation-based warfare. But they faced agile Emishi warriors on horseback, emerging suddenly from forests or hills, loosing accurate arrows, then vanishing like the wind. These hit-and-run tactics were incredibly effective, causing casualties and demoralizing the imperial forces time and again. The confrontation with the Emishi therefore became a harsh but invaluable training ground for the imperial army and the emerging warrior class. They were forced to learn, forced to adapt, or face continued failure. They recognized the importance of war horses and the superiority of mounted archery tactics. They began developing their own equestrian and archery skills, learning how to counter and even copy their opponents' guerrilla strategies, mastering the art of mounted archery kite, Banomichi, the way of the bow and horse, would later become a defining skill, a symbol of the early samurai. The barbarian enemy, through their fierce resistance, had inadvertently shaped the characteristic fighting style of their conquerors. The initial struggles against the Emishi were the very catalyst that drove the evolution of warrior tactics and skills. As a result, when the imperial forces finally succeeded in conquering much of the Emishi territory, the prestige and necessity of this warrior class were firmly established. They had proven their indispensable value in protecting and expanding the realm. This military success gave them power and leverage to demand more privileges, more land, more autonomy from the court and provincial lords. Victory against the Emishi wasn't just a territorial conquest, it was a major step forward in the samurai's ascent to power. Now, let's turn our gaze back to the glittering heart of power, Kyoto. For much of the Heian period, the emperor, descendant of the sun goddess, reigned symbolically. But the real strings of government were pulled by a single, immensely powerful aristocratic family, the Fujiwara. Through strategic marriages, wedding their daughters to emperors, ensuring their grandsons took the throne, they secured the coveted positions of regent, sesh, or kampaku, effectively dominating court politics. It seemed like the pinnacle of centralized control. Yet, here lies a profound irony. The very success of the Fujiwara in concentrating power at court paradoxically watered the seeds of samurai growth in the provinces. How? Engrossed in the intricate dance of court life, the political maneuvering, the elaborate ceremonies, the patronage of exquisite art and literature, the Fujiwara, secure in their Kyoto bubble, grew increasingly detached from the practicalities of governing the distant regions. Their focus narrowed. But their wealth, the very foundation of their luxurious lifestyle, depended heavily on the vast, productive shu-en estates scattered across those distant provinces. These estates needed managing. They needed protecting from local strife and banditry. Therefore, the Fujiwara, along with other nobles, found themselves increasingly reliant on the martial skills of the provincial bushi. They hired these warriors, the early samurai, not just as personal bodyguards in the capital, but as crucial agents in the countryside, estate managers, tax collectors, and critically armed protectors. This reliance wasn't just a simple transaction, it was a transfer of responsibility and, consequently, power. By outsourcing their security, the Fujiwara inadvertently empowered the very class that would eventually challenge them. This relationship became a crucible for samurai development. It granted them legitimacy. They were no longer just local strongmen, but agents acting with the implicit authority of the Kyoto elite. It provided them with resources, payment in kind, land rights, chiji, the means to sustain themselves and attract followers, fueling their growth. And crucially, it offered invaluable practical experience managing land, dealing with peasants, resolving disputes, and, of course, owning their military skills in real-world situations. And so, while the Fujiwara composed poetry and navigated courtly intrigue, the samurai in the provinces were learning the hard-won lessons of governance and warfare. The nobles' dependence deepened, and with it, the samurai's independent strength swelled. The guardians were slowly, surely, becoming more powerful than those they guarded. It was a classic, unfolding drama of unintended consequences, paving the way for a seismic shift in Japan's power structure. Against this backdrop of weakening court authority and increasingly assertive provincial warriors, two specific warrior clans rose to prominence, becoming defining forces in this era of Japanese history. They weren't just powerful bushi, they possessed a crucial advantage: imperial lineage. These were the Taira clans, also known as Heike, and the Minamoto clan, also known as Genji. Both clans had numerous branches originating from the imperial family itself. It was customary that when there were too many princes and princesses, some would be given a surname, like Taira or Minamoto. by the emperor and removed from the line of succession, often taking up posts in the provinces. This granted them a certain prestige and legitimacy that purely local warrior families might lack. Initially, like other Bushi, the Taira and Minamoto were employed by the nobility and the court to quell rebellions, protect territories, or participate in factional struggles within the capital. They served as the claws and fangs of the court. They proved their exceptional military capabilities in numerous conflicts, thereby accumulating more power and influence. The most powerful branches of the Minamoto and Taira gradually built strong power bases in the provinces, Minamoto primarily in the east, Taira in the west, and the Seto Inland Sea region. They were no longer just hired swords. They became de facto lords with their own armies and networks of vassals. But the parallel rise of these two mighty forces inevitably led to conflict. What began as underlying competition escalated into minor clashes. The tipping point came when a branch of the Minamoto, led by Minamoto no Yoshitomo, rebelled against the increasing dominance of the Taira. Led by Taira no Kiyomori in the mid-12th century, the Heiji Rebellion Sixer. The result: a crushing defeat for the Minamoto. Yoshitomo was killed, and his sons including Yoritomo, the future founder of the Kamakura shogunate, were exiled. Therefore, the Taira clan ascended to nearly absolute control over the imperial court. Taira no Kiyomori became the most powerful man in Japan, manipulating the emperor and placing his relatives in the highest positions. It seemed the Taira had won, but their autocratic rule and perceived arrogance bred deep resentment among other warrior families, especially the surviving Minamoto, who were biding their time and plotting revenge. The rivalry between the Taira and Minamoto was more than just a clan feud. It symbolized the culmination of the warrior class's ascent. They were no longer tools of the nobility. They were the main players, ready to contend for supreme power over the entire nation. Their distant imperial lineage gave them the pretext and prestige to rally forces. Their final showdown, the Genpei War, 1180-1185, would be a bloody epic, marking the end of the Heian period and ushering in the age of samurai dominance. We've touched upon the Shuan several times, but to truly grasp the samurai's rise, we must understand the profound impact of these private estates. They weren't just plots of land. They were the very economic engine and the fertile ground where warrior power took root and flourished. Imagine vast territories Shien owned not by the state, but by powerful nobles, influential temples, or even imperial family members. Their defining feature: they were largely exempt from taxes and operated with considerable freedom from central government control. They were, in effect, self-contained economic and administrative mini-kingdoms. As the Heian period progressed, this system exploded. Land, the lifeblood of an agrarian society, increasingly slipped from imperial control into private hands. By the era's end, astonishingly, almost all productive land in Japan had become part of a shuan. The consequence was profound. The economic foundation of the central court crumbled, while wealth became concentrated in these decentralized private holdings. This created a crucial demand. The owners of these far-flung shio needed reliable agents on the ground. They needed someone to oversee agriculture, collect dues from the peasant cultivators, maintain order, and crucially, defend the estate's borders and interests with force if necessary. Who better to fill this role than the emerging class of provincial warriors, the Bushi and samurai? And so, a vital, symbiotic dance began. The shuan proprietors needed the samurai's martial and managerial skills to secure their wealth. The samurai, in turn, needed the shuan for their livelihood, receiving payment, often in the form of land rights, chiju, within the estate itself, providing them with a stable base and income. This relationship directly fueled the growth and professionalization of the warrior class. More than just providing employment, the shuan system fundamentally reshaped the political landscape. Its inherent autonomy fostered localized power structures, moving Japan closer to a feudal model. Loyalties naturally shifted. For the peasants and the warrior, managers living and working on a shuan, the distant emperor in Kyoto became an abstract figure. Their immediate loyalty, their very survival, was tied to the local proprietor or the warrior representing them. Therefore, the shuan system didn't just weaken the central government economically, it actively cultivated the local loyalties and independent power bases that would define the coming age of the samurai. What tools did these nascent warriors wield? Their equipment wasn't merely functional. It tells a story, reflecting their primary combat roles, their social standing, and the very nature of warfare in this early period. Let's examine the signature gear that defined the Heian and early Kamakura samurai. First, the iconic sword, the taki. This long, curved blade, worn slung from the hip with the cutting edge facing down, was the precursor to the more famous katana. Why worn this way? The answer speaks volumes. It was optimized for cavalry. Drawing a long blade edge down while seated on horseback was simply more practical. The tachi's prevalence loudly proclaims the dominance of the mounted warrior, particularly the mounted archer, among the elite samurai of this time. It was a symbol of their status and preferred fighting style. But the battlefield wasn't solely the domain of elite horsemen. Enter the naginata, a formidable polearm, essentially a curved blade mounted on a long shaft. This weapon offered reach and leverage, deadly in the hands of infantry. It could slash thrust and keep cavalry at bay, proving devastating in close quarters MLAs. Its use wasn't limited to male foot soldiers. It famously became associated with powerful warrior monks, Sohi, and the skilled female warriors, Ana, Byugisha of the samurai class. The naginata's presence reminds us that early warfare involved diverse combatants and tactics beyond mounted duels. And what protected these warriors? The quintessential armor of the age was the Yoroi, the great armor. True to its name, it was imposing, somewhat boxy, and designed with one primary role in mind, protecting the mounted archer. Crafted from thousands of small, lacquered scales, kozan painstakingly laced together with vibrant silk or leather cords, odoshi, jek. It offered superb protection for the torso and shoulders, especially with its large shield, like sewed shoulder guards against incoming arrows. However, this protection came at the cost of weight and flexibility. While ideal on horseback, the Yoroi was cumbersome for fighting on foot compared to later armor designs. Its very form prioritized defense against ranged attacks over agility in ground combat. Therefore, looking at this early arsenal, the cavalryman's tachi, the infantry's naginata, the mounted archer's yoroi, we see a clear picture emerge. The elite samurai of this era were defined by their mastery of the bow and horse. Yet, the battlefield was already complex, requiring different types of warriors and weapons. This equipment wasn't static, it was the starting point for an ongoing evolution, shaped by the relentless demands of war and the changing face of the Japanese warrior. Thus, the dawn of the samurai reveals itself not as a sudden explosion, but a gradual convergence of forces, from the humble service implied by saburao, the practical need for provincial bushi to guard the sprawling shuen, the brutal forging of martial skill in the Emishi campaigns, the unintended consequences of Fujiwara dominance, the rise of imperial, blooded warrior clans like the Taira and Minamoto, the economic bedrock of the Shi-En system, and the very shape of their weapons and armor. All these threads wove the complex tapestry for the emergence of this unique warrior class. They had traversed a long, transformative path from attendants to highly skilled warriors, poised to challenge the established order. But their epic was only just beginning. The destined conflict between the Taira and Minamoto loomed, a storm that would break and reshape Japan forever. The victor would not merely claim military might, but would forge an entirely new social structure, laying the groundwork for nearly 7 centuries of samurai rule. That compelling next chapter belongs to the Kamakura shogunate, the era when the samurai formally seized the reins of power. Let's delve into how Minamoto no Yoritomo would solidify military triumph into a lasting warrior government. The dust of the Genpei War finally settled, staining the waters red, but clearing the path for a new dawn. The Taira were vanquished, their dreams of dominance drowned beneath the waves at Dan no Ura. Victorious, standing amidst the wreckage of the old order, was Minamoto no Yoritomo, but military victory alone, as the Taira themselves had learned, was fleeting. The real challenge lay ahead: how to transform battlefield success into lasting political power, how to build something enduring from the ashes. Yoritomo, shrewd and perhaps wary of the intoxicating, ultimately self-destructive allure of the Kyoto court that had ensnared his rivals, chose a different path. Instead of basking in the reflected glory of the imperial capital, Yoritomo made a decisive, strategic move. he established his headquarters far to the east, in the coastal town of Kamakura. This wasn't just a change of address, it was a statement of intent. Kamakura became the nerve center of a new kind of government, deliberately distanced from the intricate web of courtly intrigue and the diminishing influence of the emperor and aristocracy in Kyoto. Therefore, in 1192, when the emperor bestowed upon Yoritomo the title of Seitai Shogun, great general who subdues the barbarians, it wasn't merely an honorific. It was the formal recognition of a new reality. The birth of the Kamakura Bakufu, the tent government, Japan's first military shogunate. This marked a watershed moment. For the first time, real political authority decisively shifted from the civilian aristocracy to the warrior class. The emperor remained a revered figurehead, a source of ultimate legitimacy, but the actual reins of power, military, administrative, judicial, were now firmly grasped by the shogun in Kamakura. Yoritomo wasn't just a successful general, he was the architect of a new political order, laying the institutional foundations for nearly 7 centuries of samurai dominance. His choice of Kamakura signaled the creation of a distinct warrior capital, governed by warrior principles and loyalties. Winning wars was one thing, running a country was another entirely. Yoritomo understood that brute force alone couldn't sustain his regime. He needed structure, administration, a system to manage his vassals and govern the territories now under his sway. Therefore, drawing perhaps inspiration from existing administrative models, but adapting them for warrior needs, he established key governmental bodies within his Kamakura headquarters. Imagine the bustling activity within the Bakufu. There was the Mandokoro Administrative Board, functioning like a central secretariat, handling political affairs, finances, and the general administration required to keep the new government running. Then, the Manch Jos Board of Inquiry, serving as the regime's judiciary, hearing lawsuits, settling disputes among vassals, ensuring justice according to the Bakufu's emerging legal standards. But perhaps most critical to the nature of this new government was the Samurai Dokoro Board of Retainers. This body was specifically tasked with managing the heart of the Bakufu's power, the samurai themselves. It supervised the vassals, Gokunin, enforced discipline, handled military mobilization, and essentially acted as the regime's internal affairs and police force for the warrior class. The creation of these specialized offices reveals Yoritomo's sophisticated approach. This wasn't simply rule by the sword, it was the deliberate construction of a functional state apparatus designed to control territory, administer justice, and, crucially, manage the very warriors who formed its base. The existence of the Samurai Dokoro, in particular, underscores the central challenge and priority, maintaining loyalty and order within the powerful, often volatile, samurai class itself. Yoritomo's strong hand guided the new shogunate through its formative years, but his death in 1199 created a potential crisis. Would the Minamoto line continue to hold absolute power? History, once again, took an unexpected turn. Power didn't pass seamlessly to Yoritomo's sons. Instead, it was deftly maneuvered into the hands of his widow's family, the Haja clan, led initially by the formidable Haja Masako, often called the Nun Shogun, and her father, Tokimasa. They didn't usurp the title of shogun themselves. That would have been too direct, too challenging to the established order. Instead, they established the position of shikin, or shogunal regent. While young or politically weak Minamoto heirs, and later, even imperial princes brought from Kyoto, nominally held the title of shogun, the Haja shikin wielded the actual power. This created a fascinating dynamic, one that echoes the earlier relationship between the emperor and the Fujiwara regents, a separation between the symbolic authority, the shogun, and the de facto rulers, the Haji. Figures like Haja Yasutoki and Tokiori proved to be capable administrators, continuing to consolidate the Bakufu's power and refine its governance. But the shogun became little more than a figurehead, a puppet whose strings were pulled by the Haja regents in Kamakura. This strategy of ruling through the established institution, rather than overthrowing it entirely, proved remarkably successful. The Haja maintained control for over a century, demonstrating a keen understanding of legitimacy and the manipulation of political structures, a recurring theme in Japanese history where true power often resided behind the official facade. How did the Kamakura shogunate, whether led by Minamoto or Hojo, actually exert control across the vast expanse of Japan? The answer lies in the cornerstone of its military and economic structure, the Gokunin system. The Gokunin were the direct vassals of the shogun, the warrior elite bound to Kamakura. This relationship was fundamentally feudal, built on a reciprocal exchange. In return for their unwavering loyalty and military service, guarding duties in peacetime, fighting in wartime, the Gokunin received crucial benefits. The shogunate confirmed their rights to their existing ancestral lands, Hanri, or granted them new territories. Crucially, loyal Gokunin were often appointed to powerful local positions JIT and Shugo. Imagine the JIT as land stewards, or estate managers, appointed by Kamakura to oversee specific shun or public lands. Their job was to manage the land, ensure taxes and dues were collected, a portion of which went to Kamakura, and maintain local order. The Shugo, on the other hand, held a broader brief. They were provincial military governors, responsible for overall military affairs, law enforcement, and managing the Gokunin within their assigned province. Therefore, the Gokunin system, with its exchange of land and position for military fealty, forged direct lines of obligation and control radiating outwards from Kamakura. It bypassed the old imperial administrative structures, creating a distinctly military-based network of power. This system allowed the shogunate to mobilize loyal warriors from across the country and project its authority into the provinces like never before. It was the essential framework of Kamakura feudalism. But, as with many systems of delegated authority, it contained the seeds of future problems. Over time, these powerful local officials, especially the Shugo, would inevitably accumulate more power in their own right, potentially becoming strong enough to challenge the center that appointed them, a tension that would fully bloom in later centuries. The relationship between the old imperial court in Kyoto and the new military power in Kamakura remained uneasy. In 1221, this tension erupted into open conflict. Retired Emperor Go-Toba, yearning to restore the direct political authority of the throne, rallied supporters among disgruntled court nobles and some Western warriors, declaring the Haja regent Tsuyoshitoki at the time an outlaw and calling for his overthrow. It was a bold gamble to turn back the clock, but the gamble failed spectacularly. The Kamakura forces, rallied perhaps by the stirring words of Haja Masako and led efficiently by the Hajo, responded with swift and decisive military action. The imperial coalition crumbled quickly. The Jei-Kite War, though brief, had profound consequences. Therefore, the victorious Bakufu flexed its muscles as never before. Go-Toba and other participating imperial figures were exiled. Large swaths of land belonging to defeated court aristocrats were confiscated, and who received these lands? Loyal Gokunin, particularly warriors from the eastern provinces, who were now strategically implanted in western Japan, further solidifying Kamakura's grip. Furthermore, the Bakufu established the Rokuhara Tandai, a permanent administrative and military office in Kyoto itself, tasked with watching over the court and managing Bakufu affairs in the west. The Jei-Kite War was a definitive turning point. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a political statement. It unequivocally demonstrated that real power in Japan now resided not with the emperor by divine right, but with the military might of the Kamakura shogunate. The court was firmly relegated to a subordinate, largely ceremonial role. The warrior government's supremacy was now undeniable. Just as the Kamakura shogunate seemed to reach the zenith of its power, it faced an unprecedented external threat: the mighty Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan. Intent on adding Japan to his vast domain, Khan launched two massive invasion attempts. Fleets carrying Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops descended upon the shores of Kyushu. This was a trial unlike any the samurai had faced before. They were confronted with unfamiliar tactics, coordinated group movements, terrifying exploding projectiles, early gunpowder bombs, starkly different from their own traditions, often emphasizing individual combat and archery. The samurai fought fiercely, defending their homeland with desperate courage along coastal walls. But the ultimate defeat of the Mongols, in both attempts, owed a significant debt to nature. Massive typhoons, later revered as the kamikaze, or divine winds, rose up and decimated the invading fleets, wrecking ships and drowning thousands. The successful defense against the Mongols was a moment of national crisis averted, temporarily uniting Japan against a common foreign enemy. It undoubtedly boosted the prestige of the samurai as the defenders of the realm and cemented the myth of Japan as a divinely protected land. Therefore, on the surface, it seemed like a triumph. But the victory came at a crippling cost, one that would ultimately unravel the fabric of the Kamakura regime. The fundamental principle of the Gokunin system was reward for service, usually through land grants. However, this was a defensive war. There were no conquered territories to distribute. The shogunate had incurred massive expenses mobilizing defenses across the country, but it had little to offer the thousands of Gokunin who had fought bravely and suffered losses. This inability to adequately reward its vassals created widespread discontent and financial hardship among the warrior class. Loyalty, once bought with land and status, began to fray. The very system that had built Kamakura's strength was now strained to the breaking point by the aftermath of its greatest military challenge. The divine winds had saved Japan, but they also sowed the seeds of the shogunate's eventual decline. Amidst the political consolidation and external threats, how did the Bakufu maintain internal order among its often contentious warrior vassals? A key development was the promulgation of the Goseibai Shikimoku, or Ji Shikimoku, in 1232 by the capable Hajjau regent Yasutoki. This wasn't just another set of regulations, it was a landmark legal achievement. This document, consisting of 51 articles, represented the first codified body of law created by and for the warrior class. Significantly, it wasn't based on the complex, Chinese-influenced legal traditions of the imperial court. Instead, it drew upon the existing customs, precedents, and principles of res, reason or natural justice that were already accepted within warrior society. It addressed practical matters crucial to the samurai land ownership disputes, inheritance rights, the duties of jit and shugo, criminal offenses, and how conflicts should be resolved. Written in relatively clear Japanese, it aimed to provide fair and understandable standards for settling disputes. Therefore, the Goseibai Shikimoku was more than just a law code. It was a powerful assertion of the samurai's distinct legal and social identity, separate from the courtly world. It implicitly declared their judicial independence. By formalizing warrior customs into law, the Hajjau regime sought to stabilize society, reduce conflicts among its vassals, and build trust by providing a predictable legal framework. It was a savvy move to ensure the longevity of their rule by offering justice grounded in the warrior's own reality, rather than imposing unfamiliar laws from Kyoto. Laws provided structure, but what about the spirit, the guiding ethos of these warriors? The Kamakura period is widely considered the crucible where the foundations of Bushido, the way of the warrior, were forged. This wasn't yet the codified, philosophical system it would become in the later Edo period. Instead, it was a more practical, battlefield, tested set of values emerging directly from the experiences of the Genpei War and the demands of the Gokunin system. At its heart lay unwavering loyalty to one's immediate lord, the lifeblood of the feudal relationship. Coupled with this was the absolute necessity of martial prowess. Akataba no Michi remained central: personal honor, strict discipline, and a profound readiness to face death without flinching. Life was precarious, combat brutal. Accepting mortality was essential. Therefore, this early Bushido served a crucial function. It helped create a distinct class identity for the samurai. It set them apart from the court nobles, ulls through martial values, and the common folk through privilege and responsibility. This shared ethos, emphasizing loyalty, courage, and skill, fostered cohesion within the warrior class and helped justify their newly acquired position as the ruling elite. It was less about abstract philosophy and more about the practical virtues needed to survive and thrive in a world defined by military power and feudal obligation. Seeking spiritual grounding and mental fortitude. Many samurai during the Kamakura period found a powerful resonance in a newly imported school of Buddhism Zen. Introduced from China, Zen Buddhism, with its emphasis on discipline, self-reliance, meditation zazen, mindfulness, direct experience over scripture, mental toughness, and the calm acceptance of impermanence and death, struck a deep chord with the warrior mindset. The ruling Hajju regents, particularly Tokiori and Tokimune, who faced the Mongol invasions, became active patrons of Zen. They invited prominent Chinese Zen masters like Langxi Daolong to Japan and encouraged the practice among their vassals. Why did Zen appeal so strongly? It offered the samurai a practical path to mastering fear, achieving mental clarity in the chaos of battle, and acting decisively without hesitation. The focus on rigorous self-discipline mirrored the martial training they endured. The acceptance of life's transience provided a framework for facing the ever-present possibility of death. Therefore, Zen wasn't just adopted as a religion, it became a psychological toolkit for the warrior. Its influence permeated samurai culture, shaping not only their spiritual outlook, but also their approach to martial arts and even aesthetics. The Hajo's patronage likely had strategic elements too, fostering disciplined and loyal warriors, while also enhancing the cultural prestige of their Kamakura regime, distinguishing it from the older Buddhist sects associated with the Kyoto court. Zen provided the steel within the samurai spirit. So, what was daily life like for a samurai during this formative period? It was a world shaped by military obligations and the evolving feudal structure. Many samurai lived under the patronage of their lords, often congregating in nascent castle towns. Their status determined the size and location of their residences. Their diet was simple, primarily rice, often brown rice, as white rice was a luxury, fish, and vegetables. Training was paramount and began early. Young samurai were rigorously schooled in the core martial arts, swordsmanship, kinjutsu, archery, kyujutsu, and horsemanship, bujutsu. But it wasn't all about combat. The ideal emerging was bunba raid, the literary and martial arts in harmony. Samurai were increasingly expected to be literate, capable administrators, perhaps even composing poetry or studying Buddhist texts, reflecting the Zen influence. Intriguingly, women of the samurai class during the Kamakura period often enjoyed more rights and influence than in later eras. Records show they could inherit property and, in some cases, even head a household if no suitable male heir existed. The powerful example of Haja Masako herself speaks volumes about the potential for female agency within this warrior society, a contrast to the more rigidly patriarchal structure that would develop later under Neo-Confucian influence. Therefore, the Kamakura samurai was ideally envisioned as a well-rounded individual, a skilled warrior, yes, but also educated, culturally aware, and bound by loyalty. Their lives revolved around service, training, managing affairs, and navigating the complex web of feudal relationships, all under the watchful eye of the Kamakura shogunate and increasingly influenced by the austere discipline of Zen. The Kamakura period firmly established the samurai as the dominant force in Japanese society. They created a stable military government, developed a unique legal code, embraced Zen Buddhism, and began to articulate the core values of Bushido. Minamoto no Yoritomo's vision, consolidated by the Hage regents, had fundamentally reshaped Japan. But the seeds of instability, sown particularly by the economic fallout from the Mongol invasions and the inherent tensions within the Shugo system, were beginning to sprout. The loyalty of the Gokunin was weakening, and the carefully constructed balance of power was becoming fragile. The stage was set for another period of upheaval and transformation, leading eventually to the fall of Kamakura and the rise of a new shogunate, the Ashikaga, centered back in the volatile heart of Kyoto. The Kamakura shogunate, once the unshakable bedrock of samurai rule, had finally fractured. Its authority, eroded by the impossible burden of unrewarded sacrifices after repelling the Mongol hordes and weakened by internal power plays among its leading families, gave way. Into this vacuum stepped an unlikely figure, not a warrior lord vying for supremacy, but the emperor himself. Daigo, a sovereign possessed of a potent mix of imperial pride and perhaps a profound underestimation of the forces he sought to command, saw his chance. This wasn't just about restoring prestige, it was an audacious attempt to rewind history, to dismantle the warrior government entirely and reinstate direct imperial rule, as it had existed centuries before. This bold vision, launched in 1333, became known as the Kemu Restoration. The Kemu Restoration, a fleeting dream against the warrior tide Daigo's ambition was nothing short of revolutionary for its time. He envisioned a centralized state governed from Kyoto, where the intricate hierarchies and elegant rituals of the court held sway, where the emperor's word was absolute law, and where the warrior class would return to its former position, protectors, perhaps, but certainly not rulers. He moved swiftly, attempting to unravel the complex tapestry of land ownership, particularly the powerful show and estates that formed the economic base of many warrior families, hoping to redirect wealth and loyalty back towards the throne. He courted the great Buddhist temples, traditional allies of the court, showering them with favors and land grants, hoping to solidify a non-military power base. Imagine the atmosphere in Kyoto's a heady mix of triumph and uncertainty. Court nobles, long relegated to the sidelines of real power, likely celebrated the apparent return of their former glory. Ancient ceremonies were revived, promotions handed out based on lineage, and courtly favor rather than battlefield prowess. But outside the capital, in the provinces where the warriors held sway, a different mood prevailed. Disquiet grew into resentment, then hardened into outright opposition. Why did this ambitious restoration fail so quickly, collapsing in just 3 short years? The reasons were manifold, but they all stemmed from a fundamental disconnect between the emperor's courtly ideals and the harsh realities of warrior power. Daigo, raised within the rarefied air of the palace, simply failed to grasp the motivations and expectations of the samurai class. These were men who had shed blood, who measured status by martial skill and landholdings, who expected tangible rewards for their allegiance. Instead, they saw the spoils of victory over Kamakura flowing primarily to court aristocrats and powerful monasteries. Land redistribution policies, rather than clarifying ownership, often created more disputes and alienated key warrior families who felt their traditional rights were being trampled. New taxes were levied specifically targeting the warriors, adding insult to injury. Furthermore, the emperor seemed determined to govern through the old, often inefficient, court bureaucracy, appointing nobles with little practical administrative or military experience to positions of authority in the provinces. This directly clashed with the established networks of loyalty and control the warriors had built over generations. It felt like a deliberate attempt to sideline them, to negate the very power they had fought so hard to achieve under Kamakura. The warriors hadn't overthrown one master merely to submit to another who seemed utterly oblivious to their sacrifices and essential role. They felt betrayed, unappreciated, and increasingly alarmed by the direction the restoration was taking. Into this cauldron of discontent stepped Ashikaga Takagi. A man of significant warrior lineage and proven military capability, Takagi had been instrumental in Daigo's initial success against the Haja regents of Kamakura. He was a key player, expecting significant reward and influence in the new order. But like many of his peers, he grew deeply disillusioned with Daigo's policies. Perhaps driven by genuine frustration, perhaps by cold, calculated ambition, or likely a potent mix of both. Takagi saw that the emperor's dream was built on foundations of sand. He recognized the tide of warrior sentiment turning against the throne. Making a fateful decision, Takagi broke ranks. He rallied disgruntled warriors to his banner, presenting himself not necessarily as a rebel against the imperial institution itself, but as a champion of the warrior class against the perceived injustices and incompetence of Daigo's specific rule. The ensuing conflict was swift and decisive. Takagi's seasoned warriors easily overcame the forces scraped together by the court. Daigo was forced to flee Kyoto, his dream of restored imperial power shattered. The Kemu Restoration, a brief, idealistic interlude, served only to prove one undeniable truth: the age of warrior dominance was here to stay. The samurai would dictate the future of Japan, not the courtiers in Kyoto. With Daigo driven from the capital, Ashikaga Takagi stood as the preeminent military figure. Following the precedent set by Minamoto no Yoritomo, he sought and eventually received the imperial commission, being appointed shogun around 1338. This marked the official beginning of the Ashikaga Shogunate Sen, also known as the Muromachi Shogunate, after the Muromachi district in Kyoto, where its headquarters would eventually be firmly established. But Takagi made a crucial choice that immediately differentiated his regime from its Kamakura predecessor. Instead of maintaining a strategic distance from the imperial court, Takagi planted his government right in the heart of Kyoto. This decision would have profound and lasting consequences. On one hand, it allowed the Ashikaga shoguns direct influence over the imperial court, ensuring its symbolic legitimacy remained tethered to their rule. It also placed them at the center of the nation's cultural and economic life. But this proximity came at a significant cost. Unlike the relative isolation of Kamakura, which had insulated the first shogunate from the capital's debilitating factionalism. The Ashikaga Bakufu was immediately immersed in the volatile currents of court politics and the ambitions of powerful noble families and Buddhist institutions based in and around Kyoto. This constant exposure made the Ashikaga regime inherently more susceptible to intrigue, instability, and the pressures of competing power centers right on its doorstep. Furthermore, the very foundation of the Ashikaga shogunate differed from Kamakura's. Yoritomo had built his power on a relatively solid base of direct vassals, Gokunin, whose primary loyalty was to Kamakura, cemented by clear land grants and the Jittekshugo system. Takagi, however, had come to power largely through alliances forged with other powerful, independent warrior chieftains during the fight against Daigo, and before that, the Hijyo. Therefore, his shogunate began life not as an undisputed master, but more as a first among equals. Its authority depended heavily on maintaining the delicate balance of power among, and the often fickle loyalty of, the great provincial military governors, the Shugo. These powerful regional magnates were not simply administrators appointed by the shogun. They were often allies whose support was essential for the shogunate's survival. This fundamental difference in structure, its location in Kyoto, and its greater reliance on powerful, semi-autonomous regional lords imbued the Ashikaga shogunate with a structural fragility from its very beginning. While it inherited administrative bodies like the Mandokoro, Administrative Board, and Samurai Dokuro, Board of Retainers, from Kamakura, real power often resided not just with the shogun, but with powerful deputy positions like the Kenri, shogunal deputy or chancellor. This position, often dominated by turns by members of the most powerful Shugo families, like the Hosokawa, Shiba, and Hatakeyama, became a major prize and a source of intense political rivalry, further contributing to the shogunate's chronic instability. The Ashikaga shogunate was destined for a more turbulent existence than its predecessor. The establishment of the Ashikaga shogunate did not immediately bring peace. Emperor Daigo, though forced from Kyoto, refused to relinquish his claim to legitimacy. Fleeing south to the remote, mountainous region of Yoshino, he established a rival imperial court, becoming the standard bearer for the southern court, the Nanched. Meanwhile, the emperor installed by Takagi in Kyoto reigned as the head of the northern court, Zahokuchi. This defiant act plunged Japan into a protracted and debilitating period of civil war known as the Nanboku. Chu period is 1336–1392, the age of the southern and northern courts. For nearly 6 decades, Japan was torn in two. 2 emperors held court simultaneously, each claiming divine mandate, each supported by shifting coalitions of warrior lords. Battles raged across the country, from Kyushu in the west to the Kanto region in the east. Provinces changed hands, alliances fractured and reformed, and the countryside suffered greatly under the weight of constant warfare and the demands of competing armies. While the conflict centered on the imperial succession, the real beneficiaries were often the powerful samurai lords. The division of imperial authority created a unique political landscape. Neither court possessed undisputed legitimacy. Therefore, both the northern court, propped up by the Ashikaga shogunate, and the beleaguered southern court were utterly dependent on the military support of regional warrior chieftains to prosecute the war and simply survive. This gave immense leverage to figures like the provincial Shugo. They could demand significant concessions, titles, confirmation of land rights, increased administrative autonomy within their provinces, forgiveness for past transgressions, in return for pledging their swords to one side or the other. Loyalty became a commodity, and powerful warriors found their influence growing dramatically as both courts vied for their crucial support. The war not only weakened any notion of central authority, but actively strengthened the independence and regional power bases of the warrior class. It accustomed Japan to a state of endemic conflict and reinforced the trend towards decentralization. Finally, after decades of exhausting warfare that had drained both sides, a resolution was brokered under the auspices of the third, and arguably most powerful, Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimitsu. A charismatic and politically astute leader, Yoshimitsu managed to negotiate an end to the schism in 1392. The agreement involved the southern emperor abdicating in favor of the northern court claimant, with a promise later broken that the imperial succession would alternate between the two lines. While this formally reunified the imperial lineage and brought an end to the Nanboku Cho Wars, the damage had been done. The long conflict had irrevocably solidified the power of regional warrior lords and further weakened the practical authority of both the emperor and the Ashikaga shogun over the provinces. The stage was set for the continued rise of these regional magnates. The Ashikaga shogunate's reliance on the provincial governors, the shugo, proved to be a double-edged sword that ultimately undermined its own authority. Originally intended as agents of the central government, tasked with maintaining order and overseeing the shogun's interests in the provinces, the shugo steadily transformed throughout the Muromachi period into something far more powerful and independent, the shugo, daimyo. This evolution was gradual but relentless. Appointed to govern vast provinces, often holding the post hereditarily within powerful families like the Hosokawa, Yamana, Shiba, Hatakeyama, Teucha, Akamatsu, and Takeda, the shugo began to consolidate personal control over the territories under their jurisdiction. They went far beyond their original mandate of simply policing and military mobilization. They levied their own taxes, administered justice through their own courts, interfered in local land disputes to their own advantage, and built up personal bands of loyal warriors, kokujin local samurai, who owed allegiance directly to them, not to the distant shogun in Kyoto. They effectively absorbed the functions of the state within their provinces, transforming their position from appointed official to hereditary regional ruler. Some shugo, daimyo, grew so powerful that they controlled multiple provinces, ruling vast domains like independent kings. The Ashikaga shoguns were acutely aware of this growing threat to their authority. One key strategy they employed to try and keep these powerful magnates in check was the policy requiring the shugo, daimyo, to spend considerable time residing in Kyoto, attending the shogun's court, and participating in the central government. The logic was multi-faceted: keep potential rivals under close supervision, entangle them in the expensive and distracting social life of the capital, draining their provincial resources, and foster a sense of shared participation in the shogunate. This policy foreshadowed the more formalized Sankenkei-tai system of the later Tokugawa period. But, like many attempts at central control, this policy backfired spectacularly. While the great shugo, daimyo, luxuriated or politickied in Kyoto, they needed capable deputies to manage the day-to-day affairs of their home provinces. These deputies, known as shugodais, deputy shugo, were often drawn from powerful local samurai families within the province. Left largely to their own devices for long periods, often with considerable delegated authority, these shugodai began building their own power bases. They cultivated direct ties with the local warriors, managed the province's resources, and sometimes proved more effective and responsive rulers than their absentee lords. Therefore, the very policy designed to control the shugo, daimyo, inadvertently created a new layer of ambitious local power brokers, who in many cases would eventually grow strong enough to challenge and overthrow the shugo, daimyo families they served, becoming major players in the coming Sengoku period. This phenomenon of the deputy overthrowing the master, Ijikakujo, became a hallmark of the era. Consequently, the Ashikaga shogun often found himself in an incredibly precarious position, attempting to maintain a semblance of authority over increasingly powerful and autonomous shugo, daimyo, who in turn were sometimes being undermined by their own ambitious deputies back home. The shogun's power became less about command and more about intricate diplomacy, balancing rivalries, mediating disputes, and relying on personal prestige rather than institutional strength. The shogunate resembled less a government and more a fragile confederation of powerful barons, loosely held together by a figurehead whose real power was constantly contested. It was a structure ripe for collapse. The simmering tensions and structural weaknesses of the Ashikaga shogunate finally boiled over into catastrophic violence in the mid-15th century. The trigger was, ostensibly, a succession dispute surrounding the 8th shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa. Yoshimasa, a man more interested in art and aesthetics than governance, initially named his brother as his heir. But then his influential wife, Hino Tomiko, gave birth to a son, and factions quickly formed supporting each potential claimant. This internal family squabble, however, was merely the pretext for a far larger conflict. The real fuel for the fire was the intense rivalry between the two most powerful shugo, daimyo clans of the time, the Hosokawa clan, led by Katsumoto, and the Yamana clan, led by Zen, who was also Katsumoto's father-in-law, adding a layer of bitter family drama. Each clan commanded vast resources and huge armies of loyal samurai. Seeing the succession dispute as an opportunity to gain ultimate dominance over the shogunate and eliminate their rival, they threw their support behind opposing claimants. What followed was not a typical provincial war. Instead, the Hosokawa and Yamana, along with their numerous allies among other Shugo, daimyo families, brought their massive armies, tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of warriors, crashing into the imperial capital of Kyoto itself. For over a decade, 1467-1477, the city became the epicenter of a brutal, destructive civil war known as the Chi-Nen War. The fighting was horrific. Vast sections of the meticulously planned capital, including priceless temples, ancient imperial palaces, libraries filled with irreplaceable manuscripts, and the homes of nobles and commoners alike, were looted and burned to the ground. Samurai armies clashed in fierce street battles, turning elegant avenues into killing fields. The population fled or suffered terribly. The once glorious capital was reduced to ruins, a smoldering testament to the shogunate's utter failure to control its nominal vassals. The Chi-Nen War's impact was immediate and devastating. It completely shattered the last vestiges of the Ashikaga shogunate's authority. The shogun, Yoshimasa, became a pathetic figurehead, powerless to stop the destruction consuming his own capital, retreating further into his aesthetic pursuits while the nation burned. The great Shugo, daimyo families, who had initiated the conflict, fought themselves to exhaustion, weakening their own positions and creating opportunities for lesser lords and ambitious deputies, Shugodai, to rise from the ashes. Therefore, the Chi-Nen War serves as the grim, undeniable marker for the end of any meaningful central authority under the Ashikaga and the definitive beginning of Japan's most violent and chaotic era, the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States. The old order had not just cracked, it had violently imploded, leaving a century of relentless warfare in its wake. And yet, in one of history's striking paradoxes, this period of political decay, escalating violence, and societal breakdown coincided with an extraordinary and refined flowering of Japanese culture. As the Ashikaga shogunate's political grip loosened and the nation fragmented, artistic and aesthetic sensibilities reached unprecedented heights, often directly nurtured by the very shoguns whose political failures were so apparent. This cultural brilliance, deeply infused with the principles of Zen Buddhism, manifested primarily in two distinct, influential movements. The earlier phase, flourishing in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, is known as the Kitayama culture of the Northern Mountain. Its prime mover was the third shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the same leader who brought an end to the Nanboku-Chu conflict. Yoshimitsu was a powerful and effective ruler, but he was also a man of immense wealth and sophisticated taste, determined to project an image of shogunal magnificence that rivaled, and perhaps surpassed, that of the imperial court. The ultimate expression of his vision was his stunning retirement villa nestled in Kyoto's northern hills, the Rokuin-ji, universally known today as Kinkaku-ji, the Golden Pavilion. This three-storied structure, with its top two tiers lavishly coated in gold leaf, reflected in the tranquil pond below, became a symbol of the era's opulence and Yoshimitsu's own political zenith. Kitayama culture wasn't just about gilded architecture. It saw the crucial development of no drama. Yoshimitsu's insightful patronage of the actors and playwrights Kanami and his brilliant son, Zimi, allowed them to refine Noh into a profound and highly disciplined theatrical art form, combining music, dance, masks, and minimalist staging to explore deep human emotions and Buddhist themes. Zimi's theoretical writings from this period remain foundational texts. Other arts, like elaborate renga, linked verse poetry gatherings, also thrived, while renewed diplomatic and trade relations with Ming Dynasty China brought fresh cultural currents and luxury goods to Japan, further enriching the vibrant Kitayama milieu. It was a culture reflecting power, confidence, and a certain outward-looking grandeur. Fast forward to the latter half of the 15th century, a time overshadowed by growing instability leading up to and including the Chi-Nen War. Here, under the patronage of the 8th shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, the Higashiyama culture of the Eastern Mountain emerged. Yoshimasa, unlike his grandfather Yoshimitsu, was politically inept, seemingly indifferent to the chaos engulfing the nation. Instead, he retreated into a world of artistic pursuits. His legacy is embodied by his own retirement villa in Kyoto's eastern hills, the Ji, better known as Ginkaku, the Silver Pavilion. Though his ambitious plan to cover it in silver was never realized, perhaps due to the costs of the Qi-Nin War. The understated elegance of the wooden structure, its carefully designed moss garden, and the famous sand garden became icons of a different aesthetic sensibility. Higashiyama culture represented a turn inward, a search for beauty and tranquility amidst turmoil. It was during this period that several art forms deeply rooted in Zen philosophy reached their mature expression. The tea ceremonies Kanoyu evolved from a simple monastic practice into a highly refined ritual emphasizing harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Wa-kei Jaku, practiced in specially designed, rustic tea houses. Ikebana, the art of flower arranging, moved beyond simple offerings towards structured compositions expressing natural harmony and asymmetry. Sumai-e ink wash painting, influenced by Chinese models but developing distinct Japanese styles, flourished, valuing suggestion, empty space, and capturing the spirit rather than the exact likeness of a subject. The design of gardens, particularly the Karasansui dry landscape, or Zen garden, reached its apogee, using rocks and raked sand to evoke vast landscapes and encourage contemplation, as seen at the renowned Rai and Ji Temple Garden. Underpinning Higashiyama culture was the profound aesthetic ideal of wabi-sabi. Wabi conveys a sense of rustic simplicity, quietness, and imperfection. Sabi speaks to the beauty found in aging, weathering, and the melancholic patina of time. Together, they represent an appreciation for the understated, the asymmetrical, the natural, and the transient, finding profound beauty in things humble, imperfect, and impermanent. This resonated deeply in an age of uncertainty and destruction. Therefore, the Ashikaga shoguns, along with the broader samurai elite who emulated them, played a pivotal role not just as rulers and warriors, but as crucial patrons and practitioners who shaped enduring forms of Japanese art and culture. This cultural explosion wasn't mere escapism, it was a complex response to the times, partly an effort to establish cultural legitimacy, partly a search for meaning and solace through Zen principles, and partly the natural expression of refined tastes cultivated over generations. The artistic legacy of the Muromachi period, born amidst political failure and war, stands as a testament to the resilience and complexity of Japanese culture, leaving behind aesthetic principles that continue to influence art and design worldwide. The Muromachi period stands as a dramatic era of contradictions. It witnessed the slow disintegration of central authority, culminating in the devastating Tea-Nen War that ripped Kyoto apart and plunged Japan into nationwide conflict. The Ashikaga shogunate, inherently flawed from its inception, proved incapable of controlling the powerful regional lords it depended upon. Yet, paradoxically, this same period fostered an unparalleled flourishing of Japanese arts and culture, deeply imbued with Zen aesthetics, leaving behind timeless treasures like the golden and silver pavilions, no drama, the tea ceremony, and the principles of wabi-sabi. The political order collapsed, but cultural identity was refined and deepened. The Tea-Nen War extinguished the last embers of Ashikaga authority, clearing the stage for over a century of relentless struggle for survival and supremacy among ambitious regional lords. This was the dawn of the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, an era where Japan would be reforged in the crucible of constant warfare, ultimately leading to its reunification under three extraordinary figures. The Tea-Nen War had not just damaged Kyoto, it had shattered the illusion of central authority in Japan. The Ashikaga shogun, once the nominal military ruler, was now a powerless figurehead presiding over ruins. The great Shugo, daimyo families who had dominated the previous era had bled each other dry in the decade-long conflict, exhausting their resources and weakening their grip on power. Therefore, the smoldering ashes of the capital reflected a nationwide reality. The old order was dead, and a power vacuum gaped wide open. Into this chaotic void stepped a new generation of ambitious figures, ushering in Japan's most violent, dynamic, and ultimately unifying era, the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States, a period lasting roughly from the end of the Tea-Nen War until the final consolidation of power under the Tokugawa shogunate. This was an age where only strength mattered, where loyalty was a fragile commodity, and where the very foundations of society seemed to crumble and reform with bewildering speed. The defining characteristic of the Sengoku Jidai was the pervasive phenomenon known as Jikokujo, literally, the low overthrowing the high. This wasn't just isolated rebellion, it was a fundamental principle. A societal dynamic where traditional hierarchies collapsed and raw power, ability, and ruthless ambition determined one's fate, regardless of birthright or established rank. Imagine a world where the rules no longer applied. The shogun's decrees were ignored. Powerful shugo, daimyo families, weakened by the Nen War or internal strife, found themselves challenged and often overthrown by their own formerly loyal vassals, kokujin, or local samurai lords, or even their ambitious deputies, shugode. Famous old families disappeared overnight, replaced by upstarts who proved more cunning or militarily effective. Branch families usurped main lineages. Sons turned against fathers, brothers against brothers, in relentless struggles for control of dwindling domains. Loyalty became situational, alliances temporary pacts of convenience easily broken when advantage beckoned elsewhere. It was an age of profound instability and constant betrayal. But this chaos also created unprecedented opportunities. Jikokujo meant that social mobility, though often achieved through violence, became possible in ways unimaginable in previous eras. A clever strategist, a brave warrior, or a shrewd administrator could rise rapidly through the ranks based purely on merit and results. The most stunning example of this phenomenon was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man born of humble peasant stock who, through sheer talent, charisma, and strategic genius, would rise from being a mere sandal bearer for Oda Nobunaga to become the virtual ruler of all Japan. His story, unthinkable just a century earlier, epitomized the transformative, albeit brutal, potential of the Sengoku age. It was a time that tested individuals to their limits, forging a new kind of leadership, pragmatic, ruthless, and focused solely on survival and expansion. The very definition of what it meant to be a successful warrior, a leader, was being rewritten not by tradition, but by the harsh realities of constant warfare. Out of this maelstrom of conflict, three extraordinary figures emerged, each playing a crucial, sequential role in bringing the century of chaos to an end and forging a unified Japan. They were Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, the three great unifiers. 1. Oda Nobunaga: innovation, ruthlessness, and the path to unification. The first figure to make significant strides towards unification was the audacious and revolutionary Oda Nobunaga of 1534-1582. Hailing from the relatively small province of Owari, Nobunaga possessed a radical vision, a brilliant military mind, and a ruthless pragmatism that set him apart from his contemporaries. He was impatient with tradition, scornful of outdated authority, and quick to embrace innovation, particularly in warfare. Nobunaga's rise was marked by a series of stunning military victories, often against numerically superior foes. His early triumph at the Battle of Okahazama 1560 cemented his reputation. Facing the massive army of the powerful Imagawa Yoshimoto, who was marching confidently towards Kyoto, Nobunaga launched a surprise attack during a thunderstorm, catching the Imagawa forces completely off guard and killing Yoshimoto himself. This audacious victory dramatically increased Nobunaga's power and prestige, but perhaps his most historically significant military achievement came at the Battle of Nagashino, 1575. Here, Nobunaga faced the formidable cavalry forces of the Takeda clan, widely considered among the most powerful traditional samurai armies of the era. Instead of relying solely on conventional tactics, Nobunaga deployed a revolutionary strategy. He armed thousands of his ashigaru, foot soldiers, often drafted peasants, with arquebuses teppo, the firearms recently introduced by the Portuguese. He arranged them behind wooden palisades in rotating ranks. As the famed Takeda cavalry charged, Nobunaga's gunners unleashed devastating volleys of coordinated fire, mowing down horses and riders alike. Nagashino demonstrated conclusively the power of firearms when used effectively, and signaled a fundamental shift in Japanese warfare, diminishing the dominance of the traditional mounted samurai. Nobunaga wasn't just winning battles, he was changing how battles were won. Nobunaga's innovations weren't limited to the battlefield. He implemented bold economic policies, most notably Rakuza free markets and open guilds. This policy aimed to break the monopolies held by traditional merchant guilds, encouraging free trade and stimulating commerce within his expanding territories, particularly in castle towns. He understood that economic strength was crucial to sustaining military campaigns. He also commissioned extensive land surveys, kenchi, to gain better control over resources and taxation. Politically, Nobunaga was equally ruthless. He marched into Kyoto in 1568, ostensibly to install Ashikaga Yoshiaki as shogun, but Yoshiaki quickly became a mere puppet. When the shogun dared to conspire against him, Nobunaga simply drove him out of Kyoto in 1573, effectively ending the Ashikaga shogunate after nearly 240 years, even if he never took the title of shogun himself. He demonstrated utter contempt for traditional sources of authority that stood in his way. This was most evident in his brutal suppression of powerful, militant Buddhist institutions. Seeing sects like the Tendai monks of Mount Hiei and the formidable Ikki, devout followers of true, pure land Buddhism, controlling fortified temple, cathedrals like Ishiyama Hongen, as rivals for political and military power, Nobunaga waged relentless campaigns against them, culminating in horrific massacres and the razing of their strongholds. He would tolerate no challenge to his supremacy. Conversely, he initially showed favor towards Christian missionaries, perhaps seeing them as a counterweight to Buddhist influence and valuing their access to European trade and firearms. His ambition was symbolized by the magnificent Azuchi Castle, built on the shores of Lake Biwa, a towering, innovative structure designed not just for defense, but as a breathtaking statement of his unparalleled power. But Nobunaga's relentless drive and often brutal methods created enemies. Just as he seemed on the verge of consolidating control over central Japan, his journey was cut tragically short. In 1582, while resting at the Han-ji Temple in Kyoto, with only a small contingent of guards, he was betrayed and attacked by one of his own leading generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. Trapped and overwhelmed, Nobunaga perished, likely committing seppuku amidst the flames. The first great unifier, the man who had broken so many molds, was gone before his work was complete, leaving the future of Japan once again uncertain. 2. Toyotomi Hideyoshi consolidation, ambition, and overreach. The chaos following Nobunaga's assassination could have plunged Japan back into fragmentation. But one of Nobunaga's most capable generals acted with extraordinary speed and decisiveness. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1537-1598. Hideyoshi's story is the ultimate Sengoku saga, rising from obscure peasant origins to become Nobunaga's trusted retainer, and ultimately his successor. Hearing of the betrayal at Han-ji, Hideyoshi rapidly disengaged from a campaign he was leading in the west. Force marched his army back towards Kyoto, confronted Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki, and decisively crushed the traitor. This swift vengeance immediately positioned Hideyoshi as the natural heir to Nobunaga's legacy. Where Nobunaga had been the revolutionary breaker of old structures, Hideyoshi proved to be a master consolidator and negotiator, though equally capable of ruthless military action when necessary. He skillfully maneuvered through the complex power struggles among Nobunaga's remaining vassals and sons, gradually eliminating rivals and co-opting others through a combination of military campaigns, strategic alliances, and shrewd diplomacy. Over the next decade, Hideyoshi systematically brought the remaining independent daimyo under his control. He launched successful large-scale campaigns, including the Shikoku Campaign 1585, the massive Kyushu Campaign the 1587, against the powerful Shimazu clan, and culminating in the Siege of Odawara the 1590. The fall of Odawara Castle, the stronghold of the formidable Haja clan, a different Hajo family than the Kamakura regents, who controlled the Kanto region, marked the effective completion of Japan's military reunification. After a century of incessant warfare, Hideyoshi stood as the undisputed master of the realm. Having achieved unification, Hideyoshi implemented a series of sweeping policies designed to solidify his rule and prevent the country from sliding back into chaos. These policies laid the groundwork for the social structure of the subsequent Tokugawa-era Katanagari, sword hunt. 1588. This nationwide decree ordered the confiscation of weapons, swords, spears, firearms from the entire peasantry. Its stated purpose was peaceful, claiming the metal would be used for a giant Buddha statue, but its real aim was to disarm potential sources of rebellion, like the peasant-based Ikki uprisings that had plagued Nobunaga, and rigidly enforce the separation between the warrior class samurai, who alone were permitted to bear arms, and the commoners. Take Kenchi's national land surveys. Hideyoshi initiated comprehensive and systematic land surveys across Japan. These surveys standardized measurements using a uniform koku unit based on rice yield, assessed the productivity of land, clarified ownership, and created detailed cadastral records. This gave the central government unprecedented control over the nation's agricultural resources, forming a reliable basis for taxation and samurai stipends. Formalization of class divisions. Shi-no-kei Sho Hideyoshi reinforced a rigid four-tiered class system: samurai at the top, followed by farmers densu, artisans eiku, and merchants shir at the bottom. Crucially, he enacted decrees prohibiting movement between these classes. Samurai were forbidden from returning to farming, and peasants were tied to their land. This aimed to create a stable, predictable social order and ensure a clear distinction for the ruling warrior elite. Hideyoshi, though never appointed shogun, perhaps due to his peasant origins, ruled under the title of Kampaku, imperial regent, and later Take, retired regent. He indulged in displays of immense wealth and power, constructing the massive and opulent Osaka Castle as his primary residence and the extravagant Jurakudai Palace in Kyoto. He was also a noted patron of the arts, particularly the tea ceremony, famously holding a grand tea gathering at Kitano Tenmang Shrine and engaging in a complex relationship with the great tea master Sen no Rikith, whom he later forced to commit suicide. But Hideyoshi's ambition extended beyond Japan's shores. In his later years, perhaps driven by megalomania or a need to keep his vast armies occupied, he launched two massive, costly, and ultimately disastrous invasions of Korea 1592-1598, with the fantastical goal of conquering Ming China beyond. The invasions, known as the Imjin War in Korea, caused immense devastation on the peninsula. Despite initial Japanese successes, fierce Korean resistance, led by figures like Admiral Yi Sun, Sin and his famous turtle ships, combined with Chinese intervention and logistical nightmares, bogged the campaigns down. The wars drained Japan's resources and achieved none of Hideyoshi's continental ambitions. As his health failed, Hideyoshi became obsessed with ensuring the succession of his young son, Hideyori. He established a council of 5 elders, Go, Ter, composed of the most powerful daimyo in the land, making them swear oaths of loyalty to Hideyori. However, this council, designed to maintain stability, was inherently unstable, composed of ambitious rivals. Upon Hideyoshi's death in 1598, the carefully constructed unity he had imposed on Japan immediately began to fracture, setting the stage for one final, decisive conflict. 3. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient architect of enduring peace. The third and final unifier was Tokugawa Ieyasu, 1543-1660s, arguably the shrewdest and most patient strategist of the three. Ieyasu had a long and complex career, starting as a hostage in his youth, then becoming a key ally of Oda Nobunaga, and later navigating a careful relationship with Toyotomi Hideyoshi, sometimes as a rival, sometimes as a powerful, nominally subordinate vassal. Throughout these turbulent decades, Ieyasu steadily built his own formidable power base, centered in the fertile and strategic Kanta region in eastern Japan, with his headquarters established in the small fishing village of Edo, modern-day Tokyo. This location, away from the traditional power centers of Kyoto and Osaka, proved to be a masterstroke, allowing him to develop his domain relatively independently. When Hideyoshi died, Ieyasu, as the most powerful member of the Council of 5 Elders, immediately began maneuvering to consolidate his own position. His chief rival within the council was Ishida Mitsunari, a loyal Hideyoshi retainer fiercely dedicated to protecting the interests of the young heir, Hideyori. Tensions escalated rapidly, dividing the daimyo of Japan into 2 opposing camps. The Eastern Army, led by Ieyasu, and the Western Army, rallied around Mitsunari and the defense of the Toyotomi legacy. The inevitable collision occurred in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara. This massive engagement, involving perhaps over 160,000 warriors, is considered one of the largest and most decisive battles in Japanese history. Through a combination of superior numbers, strategic positioning, and, crucially, the pre-arranged betrayal of several key Western Army commanders who switched sides mid-battle, Ieyasu achieved a crushing victory. Ishida Mitsunari was captured and executed. Sekigahara effectively eliminated organized opposition to Ieyasu's dominance and cleared his path to supreme power. But Ieyasu, ever meticulous, knew the job wasn't finished as long as the Toyotomi heir, Hideyori, remained ensconced in the mighty Osaka castle, serving as a potential rallying point for disgruntled daimyo. Therefore, after consolidating his control for over a decade, Ieyasu manufactured pretexts to launch two major campaigns against Osaka, the Winter Campaign 1644 and the Summer Campaign 1655. Despite fierce resistance from defenders loyal to the Toyotomi cause, including many Nin, or masterless samurai, Osaka Castle eventually fell. Hideyori and his mother perished in the flames, extinguishing the last potential threat to Tokugawa rule. With all rivals eliminated, Ieyasu took the final step. In 1603, he had the emperor appoint him shogun, formally establishing the Tokugawa shogunate. Unlike Nobunaga or Hideyoshi, Ieyasu focused not just on military conquest, but on creating robust political and social institutions designed to ensure lasting stability and prevent the country from ever returning to the chaos of the Sengoku Jidai. Heihis and his successors implemented policies like Sankin Keitai alternate attendance for daimyo in Edo and the Bukshihado laws for military houses to strictly control the daimyo, and eventually the policy of Sakoku national seclusion to limit foreign influence. Ieyasu's genius lay not just in winning the final battle, but in patiently building the foundations for over 250 years of relative peace and stability under Tokugawa rule, the Pax Tokugawa, that would define the subsequent Edo period. He was the ultimate survivor, the patient strategist who outlasted his more flamboyant predecessors and finally brought the age of warring states to a definitive close. While the three unifiers ultimately claimed the grand prize, the Sengoku stage teamed with other powerful and charismatic daimyo, lords carving out their own domains, each leaving an indelible mark on the era. They weren't mere footnotes, they were formidable players whose actions shaped the course of the unification struggle. Consider Takeda Shingen, a 1521-1573, the legendary Tiger of Kai. Shingen wasn't just a fearsome warrior, he was a brilliant administrator who implemented innovative flood control projects and a legal code, the Keichu Shiaheda no Shidai, that brought stability to his mountainous province of Kai. His cavalry, meticulously trained and fiercely loyal, were renowned throughout Japan, striking fear into the hearts of his enemies. His long-standing, almost mythical rivalry with Usuji Kenshin 1530-1570 AD, the Dragon of Echigo, played out in a series of dramatic, often inconclusive battles at Kawanakajima. Kenshin, contrasting sharply with Shingen's pragmatism, cultivated an image of righteous warfare, devotion to the war god Bishamonten, and almost superhuman martial prowess, earning him both fear and respect. The Sengoku Jidai was an era forged in fire. It witnessed the complete breakdown of central authority, the rise and fall of countless ambitious lords, revolutionary changes in warfare driven by firearms and mass infantry, profound social upheaval including peasant revolts and the rise of figures from humble origins, the growth of castle towns fueling economic change, the shadowy operations of ninja, and Japan's first complex encounters with the West. But through the relentless crucible of conflict, driven by the unparalleled ambition and strategic genius of Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and finally, the patient mastery of Ieyasu, Japan was pulled back from the brink of perpetual fragmentation. The age of warring states gave way to an age of enforced peace. The stage was now set for the final transformation of the samurai from battlefield warriors to administrators and bureaucrats within the rigid, stable society of the Tokugawa shogunate, the Edo period. Let's explore how peace changed the very soul of the warrior class. The smoke from Osaka Castle's funeral pyre had barely cleared when Tokugawa Ieyasu, the stoic architect of Japan's newfound unity, faced his most profound challenge. The Sengoku Jidai, a century of relentless, nation-splintering warfare, was finally over. But what does a warrior do when the drums of war fall silent? What becomes of a military class? The samurai, whose very identity, whose entire social standing, was forged in the crucible of combat when peace settles upon the land like a heavy, unyielding blanket. This was the central paradox of the Edo period, an era inaugurated by Ieyasu's shogunate in 1603, promising over 2.5 centuries of tranquility. Therefore, the story of Edo is not just one of political stability, it's the dramatic tale of the samurai's forced evolution, a metamorphosis from fierce battlefield combatants into administrators, scholars, and, in many ways, living symbols of a past glories, their sharp swords increasingly becoming ornaments of status rather than instruments of immediate conflict. Ieyasu, having witnessed firsthand the destructive ambition that had torn Japan asunder, was obsessed with one overriding goal: to create a political system so robust, so meticulously controlled, that the chaos of the Sengoku would never return. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a master institutional builder. The foundation of his enduring peace was the Bakuhan system, a seemingly paradoxical structure where the Bakufu, the shogunate government firmly established in his burgeoning capital of Edo, held supreme national authority, yet across the archipelago, some 260-odd daimyo, feudal lords, continued to govern their own domains, or han, with a significant degree of local autonomy. This wasn't a federation of equals. The daimyo were vassals, their power ultimately subject to the shogun's will. But this system was a pragmatic recognition that a vast and diverse country like Japan could not be micromanaged from a single center. Therefore, the genius of Ieyasu's design lay in how he managed these powerful lords, a system refined by his successors. He understood that loyalty, especially from former rivals, was a fragile thing. So, the daimyo were carefully categorized, their treatment and privileges dictated by their historical relationship to the Tokugawa clan before the pivotal Battle of Sekigahara. Imagine the great council halls in Edo Castle. Here, the shogun and his closest advisors would assess each daimyo. Were they shinpan, related domains, direct blood relatives of the Tokugawa main line, like the powerful houses of Owari, Ki, and Mito? These lords formed a bulwark of support, a reservoir of potential heirs, their loyalty presumed. But to prevent them from amassing too much direct administrative power, they were generally kept from the highest day-to-day operational posts within the Bakufu itself. Then there were the Fudai, the hereditary vassals. These were the families who had stood with Ieyasu before Sekigahara, who had proven their allegiance when the stakes were highest. Therefore, they became the trusted bedrock of the Tokugawa administration. They were typically granted domains of moderate size, often strategically placed like sentinels around Edo or along crucial transport arteries. And it was almost exclusively from their ranks that the shogun drew the men who would fill the most critical positions in his government, the real engines of Bakufu policy. But the greatest source of anxiety, the perpetual object of Tokugawa vigilance, were the Tazama, the outside lords. These were the powerful clans, the Shimazu of Satsuma in the far south, the Memrai of Chaosho in the west, the Date of Sendai in the north, who had only submitted to Tokugawa rule after Sekigahara, often reluctantly, sometimes after being on the losing side. They controlled vast, often distant, and resource-rich domains. The memory of their Sengoku, era power and independence was still fresh. Consequently, the Tazama were subject to the most intense scrutiny. Their domains were often on the periphery, far from Edo's direct influence. They were systematically excluded from any meaningful participation in the central government, their every move monitored, their loyalty constantly questioned. It was a relationship built less on trust and more on a carefully maintained, sometimes tense, equilibrium of power. And it was from these very Tazama domains, simmering with historical grievances and growing economic strength, that the challenge to Tokugawa rule would eventually arise centuries later. To manage this intricate web of fealty and suspicion, to translate the shogun's will into effective governance, a sophisticated bureaucracy took shape in Edo. This wasn't a government of one man, but a complex machine. At its apex sat the Rajat, the Council of Elders. Picture a select group of the most experienced and trusted Fudai daimyo, men who had risen through the ranks, now charged with the highest affairs of state. They deliberated on national policy, oversaw the conduct of all daimyo, managed the delicate and often symbolic relationship with the imperial court in Kyoto, which, though revered, was kept politically neutered and under strict Bakufu supervision, and controlled the shogunate's finances. They were the shogun's chief ministers, the daily navigators of the ship of state, but the Rajat could not attend to every detail. So beneath them operated the Wakadoshiori, the junior council, also drawn from Fudai ranks. Their focus was more internal, managing the vast body of direct shogunal retainers, the Hatamoto bannermen and Gokuninza lower, ranking housemen, who formed the administrative and military backbone of Edo itself. They handled personnel, promotions, and the myriad regulations that governed the shogun's immediate followers. And how did the Bakufu ensure that its laws and edicts were actually being followed? That dissent was not brewing in some distant domain. Through its eyes and ears, the Temetsuk chief inspectors and the Metsuk inspectors. The Temetsuk, often men of considerable standing, were dispatched to keep a vigilant watch over the daimyo themselves, reporting any signs of insubordination, illegal castle construction, or unauthorized alliances. The Metsuk, meanwhile, performed a similar role within Edo, policing the conduct of the Hatamoto and Gokunin, acting as an internal security force for the shogunal city. Their reports could make or break careers, even lead to the confiscation of a domain. Beyond these councils and inspectorates, a host of specialized bugyu, commissioners, or magistrates managed specific sectors of governance. Imagine the Kanja Bigyu, the finance commissioners, poring over ledgers, calculating tax revenues from the shogunate's own extensive lands, ex-tenryu, and managing the regime's expenditures, a task of immense complexity and critical importance. Then there were the Jisha, Bigyu, the temple and shrine commissioners, remembering the immense power and disruptive potential of militant Buddhist sects during the Sengoku period. The Tokugawa were determined to keep religious institutions firmly under state control. These commissioners oversaw all temples and shrines, ensuring they adhered to Bakufu regulations and did not become centers of political opposition. In the major cities directly administered by the shogunate Edo, Osaka, Kyoto, the Machibigi, these town commissioners wielded enormous power, acting as mayors, police chiefs, and judges responsible for maintaining order and administering justice among the burgeoning urban populations. And for the shogunate's far-flung territories, vital ports like Nagasaki or important mines, Ongoku, Biggie commissioners for distant provinces, acted as the shogun's direct representatives. This elaborate, hierarchical structure, staffed by loyal retainers, was the engine of Tokugawa rule, designed to project authority, gather information, and enforce compliance across the realm. But Ieyasu and his successors knew that mere bureaucracy was not enough to keep the powerful daimyo, particularly the Tazama, in line. Therefore, they implemented a series of ingenious, often burdensome, control mechanisms that became hallmarks of the Edo period. Chief among these was the system of Sankin Katai, or alternate attendance. This masterstroke of political engineering required every daimyo to divide his time, typically spending 1 year in residence in Edo, attending the shogun's court, and the next year in his home domain. But the true genius of the system lay in a crucial stipulation: the daimyo's principal wife and heir were compelled to live permanently in Edo, effectively as high-status hostages. The impact of Sankin Keitai was manifold. It brought the daimyo under the direct surveillance of the shogunate for extended periods. The immense financial burden of maintaining lavish mansions in both Edo and their Han, coupled with the staggering cost of the ceremonial processions to and from the capitals, often involving hundreds, even thousands, of retainers, severely strained daimyo finances, making it far more difficult for them to accumulate the resources needed to fund a rebellion. It also had unintended cultural consequences, fostering a national elite culture centered in Edo and facilitating the spread of Edo's fashions, language, and arts throughout the provinces as daimyo and their retinues traveled back and forth. The constant movement also stimulated the development of Japan's road network and the growth of post towns and related industries. Complementing Sankin Katai was the Bukushohato, or laws for the military houses. This was not a single document but a series of edicts, issued and reissued by successive shoguns, that laid down a comprehensive and highly restrictive code of conduct for the entire samurai class, from the most powerful daimyo down to the lowest ranking warrior. These laws governed virtually every aspect of their lives. Daimyo marriages required shogunal approval, a crucial measure to prevent the formation of powerful inter-domain alliances that could challenge the Bakufu. The construction of new castles was forbidden, and even repairs to existing fortifications were strictly limited and often required explicit permission. There were rules about dress, about the number of retainers a daimyo could bring to Edo, prohibitions against forming secret pacts or engaging in unauthorized disputes. The Bukushohato was a clear statement: the samurai were no longer independent warlords. They were cogs in a highly regulated state machine, their behavior minutely prescribed to ensure the stability of the Tokugawa order. And if these measures weren't enough, the shogunate held the ultimate trump card: the power to reallocate or confiscate domains. A daimyo deemed disloyal, grossly incompetent, or who failed to produce a suitable heir could face tempials, being transferred to a different, often smaller or less productive, domain, or, in the most severe cases, keiki, the complete confiscation of his lands and status. Conversely, loyal service and adherence to bakufu dictates could bring rewards. This constant threat of punishment and potential for reward served as a powerful incentive for daimyo to toe the line. The shogun was, in the end, the ultimate arbiter of a daimyo's fate, the closed country. Sakoku and the window of Dejima, while meticulously managing internal affairs, the Tokugawa shogunate also made a momentous decision regarding Japan's relationship with the outside world. The early shoguns Ieyasu, Hidetada, and Iemitsu had initially shown a degree of openness to foreign trade, particularly with the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English. Ieyasu, ever pragmatic, saw the potential benefits of access to European goods, especially firearms, and new technologies. Christian missionaries, primarily Jesuits and Franciscans, were also active, particularly in Kyushu, and had made significant numbers of converts. But this initial period of engagement gradually gave way to deep suspicion and, ultimately, a policy of severe restriction. Several factors fueled this dramatic shift. The rapid spread of Christianity became a major concern. The shogunate, deeply invested in a Neo-Confucian ideology that emphasized loyalty to one's lord, and the existing social hierarchy, saw Christianity, with its allegiance to a foreign pope and its potential to create divided loyalties among Japanese converts, as a dangerously subversive force. The Shimabara Rebellion 1637-1638, a large-scale peasant uprising in Kyushu that had strong Christian participation, though brutally crushed by bakufu forces, seemed to confirm their worst fears. It was portrayed as evidence that Christianity could incite rebellion and undermine the foundations of Tokugawa rule. Furthermore, the Tokugawa were astute observers of the wider world. They were aware of the expanding colonial empires of Spain and Portugal in Southeast Asia and the Americas. They began to fear that trade and missionary activity were merely the thin end of the wedge, a prelude to eventual military intervention and colonization. The rivalries and mutual denunciations among the various European Catholic orders and between Catholics and Protestants also did little to inspire confidence in their peaceful intentions. Therefore, driven by a desire to eliminate perceived threats to their political control and social order, and to prevent foreign powers from meddling in Japanese affairs, particularly by supporting potentially rebellious Tazama daimyo in the West who had benefited most from early trade, the shogunate, under Tokugawa Iemitsu, implemented a series of edicts from the 1630s onwards that collectively became known as the Sakoku policy, the closed country. This policy didn't mean Japan was hermetically sealed off from the entire world, but it did impose draconian restrictions on foreign contact. Japanese citizens were forbidden from traveling abroad, and those already overseas were barred from returning, on pain of death. This was to prevent the influx of foreign ideas and to sever ties that could lead to foreign alliances. Most Europeans, particularly the Spanish and Portuguese, who were most closely associated with Catholic proselytizing, were expelled. Christianity was proscribed, and a brutal campaign of persecution was launched to eradicate it from Japanese soil, forcing converts to apostatize or face martyrdom. Foreign trade, once relatively open, was now drastically curtailed and channeled through a single, tightly controlled port, Nagasaki. And even there, only 2 foreign groups were permitted to conduct business under highly restrictive conditions. The Dutch, being Protestant and perceived as less driven by religious conversion and more focused on commerce, were allowed to maintain a small trading post on the tiny, fan-shaped, man-made island of Dejima in Nagasaki harbor. They were effectively prisoners on this island, their movements strictly monitored, their interactions with Japanese carefully regulated. Yet, through this tiny, almost microscopic window of Dejima, a trickle of Western knowledge, particularly in fields like medicine, astronomy, cartography, and military science, known as Rangaku or Dutch learning, continued to seep into Japan throughout the Edo period. This limited exposure would prove to be of immense significance when Japan was later forced to confront the technologically superior West. The Chinese were also permitted to trade at Nagasaki, operating from their own designated quarter, though also under strict shogunal supervision. Beyond Nagasaki, limited, carefully managed trade relations were maintained with Korea through the Tsushima domain and the Ryukyu kingdom, largely controlled by the Satsuma domain in southern Kyushu. The Sakoku policy, which would remain largely in effect for over 2 centuries, was a defining feature of the Edo period. It succeeded in its primary aims. It insulated Japan from the perceived threats of Western colonialism and religious subversion, helped the shogunate consolidate its control, and contributed to the long era of internal peace. But this self-imposed isolation also meant that Japan fell significantly behind the West in terms of scientific, technological, and industrial development. When Commodore Perry's Black Ships arrived in 1853, their steam power and advanced weaponry would starkly reveal the price of this long seclusion, forcing Japan into another era of tumultuous change. The long, unyielding peace of the Tokugawa era presented the samurai with a profound, almost existential dilemma. For centuries, their identity, their very raison d'etre, had been forged on the anvil of war. Their skills were honed for combat, their status derived from martial prowess. But now, the battlefields lay fallow. The call to arms never came. What then was a samurai to do? How could a warrior class maintain its preeminence, its purpose, when the very conditions that had created it had vanished? They could not simply fade into the peasantry or the merchant class. Their hereditary status forbade it. Therefore, the samurai and their guiding ethos of Bushido had to adapt, to transform. This wasn't a conscious, committee-led decision, but a gradual, complex evolution driven by the new realities of peace and the intellectual currents of the time. Bushido, once a pragmatic, often brutal, unwritten code of conduct for the battlefield, began to morph into something more philosophical, more introspective, more concerned with moral character and social duty than with killing prowess. A crucial influence in this transformation was Neo-Confucianism, particularly the Jushi school, which the Tokugawa shogunate actively promoted as the official state ideology. Why? Because Neo-Confucianism, with its emphasis on social harmony, hierarchical relationships as ruler-subject, father-son, husband-wife, filial piety, loyalty, and the importance of self-cultivation and education, provided the perfect intellectual framework for the stable, ordered society the Tokugawa sought to create. For the samurai, Neo-Confucianism offered a new way to conceptualize their role. Their loyalty, once directed solely to their immediate daimyo in the context of war, was now reframed within a broader cosmic and social order, extending upwards to the shogun and, theoretically, the emperor. Their duty was no longer just to fight, but to govern justly, to administer efficiently, and to serve as moral exemplars for the lower classes. Thinkers from within the samurai class itself grappled with these questions. Yamaga Soki, 1622-1685, for example, a prominent Confucian scholar and military strategist, pondered the way of the gentleman. Shid. He argued that the samurai, freed from the immediate demands of warfare, had a unique responsibility to cultivate their moral character, to study the classics, and to embody righteousness in their daily lives. Their martial training, while still practiced, became less about preparing for imminent battle and more a means of instilling discipline, mental fortitude, and an appreciation for form and precision qualities valuable in administration as much as in combat. The sword, though still worn as the undeniable symbol of their status, became less a tool of war and more an emblem of their moral responsibility. But this intellectualization of Bushido was not without its internal tensions and contradictions. The famous, somewhat controversial text, Hagakure, In the Shadow of Leaves, compiled in the early 18th century from the sayings of the samurai Yamamoto Tsunetomo, offered a more radical, almost nostalgic vision. It passionately advocated for a return to a more fervent, death-defying martial spirit, famously stating, "The way of the samurai is found in death." For Tsunetomo, the bureaucratization and perceived effeminacy of the peaceful Edo samurai were a betrayal of their true heritage. Hagakure represented a yearning for the raw, unambiguous purpose of the Sengoku warrior, a stark contrast to the more staid, Confucianized ideal of the samurai as a scholar-administrator. Therefore, the Bushido of the Edo period was a complex tapestry, woven from threads of ancient martial tradition, Neo-Confucian ethics, and a pragmatic need to redefine the warrior's role in a world bereft of war. For many samurai, especially those in lower ranks with meager stipends and few real responsibilities, this transformation could be frustrating. They were a warrior class with no wars to fight, often living in genteel poverty, their martial skills rusting while they were expected to master calligraphy and Confucian ethics. The ideal of the cultivated warrior bureaucrat existed alongside a persistent undercurrent of nostalgia for a more glorious, martial past, and sometimes a cynical awareness of the gap between the lofty ideals of Bushido and the often mundane, restricted realities of their lives. The soul of the samurai was being reshaped, not always comfortably, by the long, unyielding peace of Tokugawa Japan. The Edo period, a vast ocean of peace after the storms of the Sengoku, fundamentally altered the landscape of Japan and the very essence of its ruling samurai class. Under the Tokugawa shogunate's meticulous and often authoritarian control, a unique society flourished, characterized by internal stability, remarkable cultural achievements, and a warrior elite transformed into an administrative caste. The policies of Sankin Tai and Sakoku, while ensuring domestic tranquility and insulating Japan from external turmoil for centuries, also created conditions of arrested development in certain technological and political spheres. But no system, however ingeniously designed, is immutable. Beneath the seemingly placid surface of late Edo society, powerful currents of change were gathering force. The rise of a vibrant merchant class, Qiao Nin, with growing economic power, but little political say, created social tensions. Many samurai, their stipends fixed while the cost of living rose, found themselves in increasingly dire financial straits, their status often at odds with their economic reality. The trickle of Dutch learning, through Dejima, though limited, began to expose Japanese intellectuals to the startling scientific and industrial advancements of the West, creating both excitement and anxiety. And in the powerful Tazama domains of the West and South, long-held grievances against Tokugawa rule simmered, coupled with a growing sense of regional pride and ambition. Therefore, when Commodore Matthew Perry's American black ships steamed into Edo Bay in 1853, their cannons and steam engines serving as an undeniable demonstration of Western military superiority, they did not arrive in a vacuum. They shattered the carefully constructed illusion of Sakoku and acted as a catalyst, igniting these latent internal pressures. The Tokugawa shogunate, which had maintained peace for so long, found itself unable to cope with this unprecedented external challenge and the rapidly escalating internal demands for change. The long Edo period was drawing to a dramatic close, setting the stage for the Meiji Restoration, a revolution that would sweep away the shogunate, abolish the samurai class itself, and propel Japan headlong into the modern world, forever changing the destiny of the warrior and the nation they had once ruled. The final chapter of the samurai story was about to be written, not with the sword, but with the forces of modernization and national transformation. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was more than just a political upheaval, it was a societal earthquake. With the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate and the emperor restored to nominal power, the very foundations of feudal Japan were dismantled. For the samurai, the hereditary warrior class that had dominated the nation for nearly 7 centuries, the changes were cataclysmic. Their stipends were commuted, their exclusive right to wear swords abolished, their distinct social status erased. Officially, the samurai ceased to exist as a class. The age of the warrior was over. But can a spirit forged over a millennium truly vanish with the stroke of an imperial pen? The legacy of the samurai, and the complex code of Bushido that had evolved alongside them, proved far more resilient than their formal titles and privileges. Though the warrior no longer strode the streets with 2 swords at his hip, the ideals they represented, or were perceived to represent, continued to resonate deeply within the rapidly modernizing Japanese psyche. Therefore, the transition was not a clean break, but a complex process of adaptation and reinterpretation. Many former samurai, possessing education and administrative experience from their roles in the Han governments, transitioned into key positions within the new Meiji government, becoming architects of Japan's modernization. They staffed the new ministries, led the nascent imperial army and navy, and became educators and industrialists. Their ingrained discipline, sense of duty, and nationalistic fervor, once directed towards their feudal lords, were now recanneled towards the building of a strong, modern nation-state capable of standing alongside the Western powers. Bushido itself, stripped of its feudal context, was reimagined and often idealized. It became a nationalistic ethos, emphasizing unwavering loyalty, now to the emperor and the state, self-sacrifice for the greater good, discipline, honor, and a disdain for materialism. These selectively interpreted warrior virtues were promoted in education, in the military, and in public discourse, serving as a powerful ideological tool to foster national unity and drive Japan's astonishingly rapid industrialization and imperial expansion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The samurai spirit became a potent symbol of Japanese uniqueness and strength. However, this romanticized and often militarized version of Bushido also had a darker side, contributing to the aggressive nationalism and emperor worship that ultimately led Japan down the path to catastrophic war in the mid-20th century. The unyielding loyalty and disregard for personal life, so valued in feudal combat, could be tragically distorted in modern, total warfare. In the aftermath of World War II, as Japan rebuilt itself as a pacifist democracy, the more overt, militaristic interpretations of Bushido were largely discredited. Yet, the underlying values continued to subtly influence Japanese society in myriad ways. The emphasis on group harmony, diligence, perseverance in the face of adversity, meticulous attention to detail, respect for hierarchy, though now often within a corporate rather than feudal context, and a deep-seated sense of obligation and responsibility can still be seen as echoes of the samurai ethos. In Japanese business practices, in the dedication found in traditional arts and crafts, and even in the disciplined pursuit of excellence in sports, one can discern the lingering spirit. Globally, the image of the samurai, often filtered through cinema, manga, and martial arts, remains a powerful and enduring icon. It speaks to a fascination with a warrior culture that valued not just strength but also art, philosophy, and a profound code of conduct. While often romanticized and sometimes misunderstood, the core ideals of honor, discipline, loyalty, and the serene acceptance of mortality continue to captivate and inspire. Therefore, though the samurai as a distinct social class vanished over a century and a half ago, their shadow looms large. Their story is a testament to the profound impact a warrior ethos can have on a nation's history and its enduring cultural DNA. From humble servants to masters of a nation through centuries of war and peace, their journey is a compelling saga of transformation, and their spirit, in its many guises, continues to whisper through the fabric of modern Japan and the global imagination. The swords may be sheathed, but the legacy endures.